We are live, right? Okay. So hello everyone again. Welcome back to our final session.
That was Vazken, I think.
The final session of today's workshop with the theme Visual Culture, right? And our first speaker is Ahmet Ersoy from Boğaziçi University. So I'll first make a very short introduction to Ahmet Hocam, and then we'll leave the screen to him. Ahmet Ersoy is Associate Professor at the History Department of Boğaziçi University. His works on the history of late Ottoman Empire with a special focus on the changing role and status of visual culture in a period of modernizing change. He is the author of, actually the book was already referred more than once today, Architecture and the Late Ottoman Historical Imaginary, Reconfiguring the Architectural Past in a Modernizing Empire, which was published in 2015. Ersoy's recent research involves the entwined histories of photography and print culture. So thank you, Ahmet Hocam, for being with us today, and the screen is yours. You can share your...
Yes, I will. Thank you, Semra, for the introduction. And it's great to be here. I think I was able to share my screen. I'm hoping you can see it. Let's do full screen. Okay. All right. So let's start with a date, 1891. In 1891, the larger-than-life superstar of Ottoman literature, Ahmet Mithat, whose name has been mentioned many times today, published his travel account of a leisurely fishing excursion to the eastern coast of the Marmara Sea, conducted with a couple of friends on a luxury boat. Entitled Seyyadane Bir Cevelan, a hunterly excursion, the account was first serialized in Mithat's own newspaper, the Tercümanı Hakikat. Defining such excursions as a polite form of sportsmanly entertainment pursued by progressive members of the society, the author also praised these writings for their informative anecdotal value conveyed through the personal perspective of the traveler. Accordingly, Ahmet Mithat's travelogue, coming from a renowned journalist, novelist, author of many popular history books, is colored with his lively personal take on sights and events he encountered during the four-day voyage. What is particularly captivating in the narrative is the vivid manner in which he weaved together practical information about the present condition of the sites he contemplated from the boat with myths, legends, and scholarly accounts on their recent or distant history. Sailing around the Leander's Tower alongside the Anatolian coast of Istanbul, Mithat passionately harks back to Greek mythology and ancient history, each visual encounter across the coastline becoming an occasion to summon histories about the Argonauts, the Roman exploits, or the return of the 10,000. Skirting along the Moda coast, he visualized the details of a magnificent statue of Venus erected by the side of the long extinct Byzantine quay, rising from the bubbles of crushing waves. This image of Venus rising from sea bubbles, very striking. Across Maltepe into the Marmara Sea, which is, I guess, one of the bleakest landscapes in Istanbul today, he recounts the story of an early battle between the Ottomans and the Byzantines, which he had portrayed in detail in one of his popular history books. Mithat confesses that the Ottoman land is such a rich depository of strange historical events that, I'm quoting, "I am unable to arrest the power of my memory," he says. Somebody stop me. Inadvertently, stories and images of the past regenerate themselves as I experience a geography infused with the power of history, end quote. The constant desire to laminate space and historical knowledge, the dense layering of topography and history in Ahmet Mithat's narrative is symptomatic of the expanding boundaries of historical imagination in the late Ottoman domain. The meteoric rise of Ottoman interest in comprehensive universal histories in this period was coupled by a growing fascination with popularized renditions of history, minutely exploring the textures and particularities of the local past. Myriad forms of popular history writing revealed the diversifying tastes of a broadening readership and the growing provenance of an urban middle-class interest in everyday mundanities of the past. Such pluralizing inclinations, informing a temporal and thematic expansion of historical thought, can be traced back to the 17th century in the Ottoman context as palpable signs of a broad early modern cultural transformation. But the rise in scale, intensity, and diversity of popular representations of history in the 19th century, bringing together globalized grand narratives alongside localized and ordinary ones, reveals the transformative impact of a burgeoning print industry and journalism in the empire. The expansion and diversification of historical imagination in the 19th century also bespoke of a radical transformation in the conceptions of time precipitated by the rise of sciences dependent on deep temporal perspectives such as archaeology, geology, and paleontology, which challenged the human-centered understanding of temporality promoted by conventional historical writing and religious cosmology. So new and more intensely layered visions of time in the 19th century not only included records of ancient battles and monuments, but also the bewildering immensity of pre-human deep time, evidenced by archaeological finds, geological strata, and fossils. My study brings into focus late Ottoman photographic excursions as the prevailing medium for articulating new modes of seeing and of engagement with the historical topography of the empire. A large majority of these excursions were published in the journal Servet-i Fünun in serialized form from the early 1890s. And some were later marketed as illustrated books. Motivated by enhanced means of transportation in the empire, the expanding road networks, railroads, steamship travel, and of course, advancements in technology, especially in the technology of the camera, as it becomes more mobilized in the 1880s after the invention of the Kodak box, Ottoman men of reasonable substance, journalists, officers, and photography enthusiasts took to the road. Sometimes they followed the traces of cyclists in Istanbul meadows. Sometimes boarded railway carriages traversing the Anatolian countryside, and at times roamed the far extremities of the empire, eager to relay their personal experiences through the mediation of their notebooks and portable cameras. The serialized travel diaries were accompanied by photographs of landscapes, towns, their inhabitants, historical sites, and monuments from around the empire. The full cumulative experience of travel conveyed in the memoirs also involved a rich mixture of references to the old and the new. Human interest stories, accounts of everyday mundanities, and the changing imperial present are closely knit together with those on the multi-layered deeper pasts of the Ottoman land, involving its geological underlayers, archaeological treasures, historical monuments, as well as legends and myths. The overwhelming sense of the present that pervades these accounts is therefore complemented by a richly layered and multi-threaded sense of history mediated by the serialized order of narrative and photography. Thanks to the intensely visual format of the photographic excursions, travel functioned as a form of popular archival practice, whereby readers participated in a new extended sense of locality and spatial temporality. Conflating stories and photographic traces of the past, these accounts help visualize, narrativize, and memorialize historical spaces that were deemed essential for the consolidation of imperial identity. At the core of my interest in late Ottoman photographic excursions is this layered and highly visualized form of temporality, embedded in the serialized flow of the travel narrative. Ahmet İhsan, the editor-in-chief of the most popular illustrated journal Servet-i Fünun, characterized his outings with the camera as excursions, cevelan, specifically conducted in the manner of illustrated journalism. He knew that the real captivating power of the illustrated journal inhered in its dynamic multiplex format and its rich visual content, in particular the high-quality photographic imagery transferred on the page through advanced technologies of reproduction like zincography or autotopy. These articles represented a new intermediate genre in late Ottoman print culture, compounding the sequential discursive order of stories and the immediate material rawness of photographs as documents. The illustrated travels conveyed to the readers tactile, embodied visions of imperial space, playing an essential role in the expansion and stratification of collective memory. The photographic travel narratives provide us with a unique chance to investigate the ways in which selected visions of the past inhered in the volatile, personalized present of Ottoman life. The ultimate aim of my study, therefore, is to examine how this new dynamic vision of reality and the alternative, more popular forms of historical knowledge it fostered was galvanized by the mass impact of photography and its techno-archival power. This, in other words, is an effort to trace out the new materialized presence of the past within the dynamic field of knowledge espoused by the journals. My main source of analysis in this study is the Servet-i Fünun, indisputably the primary venue for the publication of illustrated travel narratives. And I concentrate on the age of the rapid popularization of the journals in the Ottoman world, coinciding with the authoritarian rule of Sultan Abdülhamid II from 1876 to 1909. As personalized accounts on imperial geography and history, narratives of travel in illustrated journals are salient indicators of the changing ways in which space and time were experienced and conceptualized in the Turkish-speaking Ottoman domain. Not only do they evince the radical contraction of global and imperial space, with the distant becoming near through new media technologies like telegraphy or photography, but they also testify to the very contraction of time as the multimedial format of the journals allowed for the constant conjunction of short-term data with that of deep time and archaeology. The endless flow of European scientific articles and photographs into the Ottoman print space produced a melange of layered time registers in almost every issue of the illustrated journals. Essays and images on geology, evolution, and archaeology were coupled and interwoven with those on the Crusades and the Alhambra, or with the, the fruit sellers of Istanbul, pickle vendors of Damascus, and so on. Ahmet İhsan's journalistic account of his Syrian railway excursion, for instance, taking him from Beirut to Jerusalem via Jaffa, is thoroughly imbued with the experience of such deeply layered temporality. And you can see this in the 2 pages I put here. On the left, you of course have the Wailing Wall, and on the right, Ahmet İhsan put the images of the Damascene, Jewish Damascene singers that he enjoyed so much in a nightly outing, for instance. So there's this constant juxtaposition of the contemporary and the historical, everyday and the academic. The geography, townscapes, and monuments of this ancient region prompted Ahmet İhsan to reconsider the role of Palestine within a vastly extended vision of world history. He argued that when an observer acquires sufficient information on the history and geography of a certain region, supplementing it by a comprehensive knowledge of its antiquities, and I quote, "What appear at first to be landscapes and dismal ruins turn into sites worthy of interest, whereby the associations between the present and the past become manifest in perfectly visible form," end quote. Ahmet İhsan's historical narrative not only invokes the distant historical figures inhabiting the region, like Babylonian rulers, first caliphs of Islam, Phoenician merchants, but also incorporates a deeply historicized vision of its natural environment and geological underground. Traversing the Hawran region in Syria, for instance, he immediately diagnoses the landscape to be composed of a thick volcanic residue exhibited by the dark color of the soil and its unique form of mineral sedimentation. Further along the road towards Jerusalem, contemplating the surrounding hills from his train window, he draws attention this time to the non-volcanic character of the geography on which the ancient city stood, and marks out the uniform stratification of its geological underlayers as indicative of eons of stable aggregation undisturbed by earthquakes. That's how he reads the landscape. Both Ahmet İhsan's and Ahmet Mithat's visions of Ottoman geography testify to a radically historicized vision of the natural environment. The idea that the present coexists with the very ancient and the primordial, that a distant alien past is immediately and tangibly present in the mundane texture of everyday reality, is a characterizing feature of the 19th century's expanded and pluralized form of historical consciousness. Rather than being a mode of nostalgic reversion, which would demand the evasion of contemporary reality, this vision is grounded in what Kitty Hauser calls archaeological imagination, involving a keen awareness about the material imminence of the past in the present. It was this modern, intensely temporalized vision of lived space that made Ottoman authors more attuned to the materiality and historical stratification of imperial geography. In the case of the journals, the photographs accompanying travel narratives help further enhance the image of the imperial domains as a densely layered space in which several traces of the past and the present congealed. Photography, with its technical capacity to arrest the surface traces of life in excessive, exorbitant detail, was a most fitting medium for indexing this type of multi-layered temporal density. Photography's thick surface detail rendered multiple marks of time immediately and simultaneously present. This layered sampling of time, permanently fixed in the photograph as an object of observation, provided an occasion to go beyond the established routines of history. Based on a dense, visceral form of contact with the physical world, photography carried the potential to induce non-sequential links, uncalled for juxtapositions, and reciprocities between various physical traces of the past, making its audiences more attuned to the coexistence of different layers of time. Readers of journals, such as the Servet-i Fünun, were conversant with this type of temporal reciprocation. The presence of photography contributed to a new visibility of the past, both in radically extended form, as well as in the minutely materialized personal scale of quotidian life. For modern Ottomans like Ahmet Mithat, whose everyday encounters with geography were imbued with the power of historical memory, photographs provided a tangible, embodied means through which layered visions of the past were regenerated and attached to the land. And this image, you have a monument from Tripoli juxtaposed with another image on the bottom right. This is a person, a travel agent that Ahmet İhsan had to share his cabin with in the boat, and he kept snoring through the night and he couldn't sleep at all. And so that's, I don't know, yet another juxtaposition for you. Of course, one should also note that in the case of the late Ottoman Empire, popular journals like the Servet-i Fünun were deeply harmonized with the ingrained hierarchies of the empire. They tended to privilege, mostly in undisguised univocal fashion, the visions and historical biases of the dominant Sunni Muslim, urban, Turkish-speaking middle classes in the empire. Images of religious buildings or monuments belonging to the substantial non-Muslim communities, like the Greeks, Armenians, or Jews, rarely made it to the mainstream channels of Turkish language Ottoman media. Neither was there any mention of these communities' local sensibilities about the past or their visions of a geography they shared with the dominant Muslim element. And here, of course, we have the increasing presence of a vision of history produced by and catering to prescribed audiences that are becoming increasingly more segregated along ethno-religious lines. As a new and popular media format occasioned by the journals, illustrated travel narratives helped generate a collective and embodied experience of the empire for these designated audiences. Allied with technologies such as photography, telegraphy, the steamship, and the railway, illustrated travel narratives introduced an entirely new mode of interaction with space, making the empire more closely and tangibly accessible to Turkish-speaking Ottoman readers. The composite fragmentary structure of the journals and their rich visual and textual content generated serialized and synthetic modes of reading and seeing. The entirety of the empire, with its present and its deep pasts, emerged in an all-embracing conglomeration of images and text fragments endlessly accumulated, endlessly updated in the context of a modern archival enterprise. The eclectic, inclusive format of the journals facilitated the conjunction of different modes of engagement with the past, the semantic order of the textual record interwove with the visual record, raw visual record, and protocols of the literary and academic collided with the clutter of the jocular and the lowbrow. Images, photography, of course, in particular, helped reconcile and suture these differences, allowing contemplative links between textual fragments and mediating visions of the past with the leveling impact of its cold mechanical accuracy. The sheer abundance of photography contributed immensely to the emergence of a more pluralized and stratified vision of imperial heritage in the Ottoman domain and to its placement within a broader globalized order of history. The 19th century's popular journalistic mode of writing, with its fondness for the everyday and its appeal to middle-class taste, played a major role in the pluralization of history in the Ottoman domain. At the end of the century, photography emerged as a powerful agent in the expansion of collective memory and the transmission of new historical sensibilities through its growing presence in print culture. Travel accounts, city letters, or letters with photographs published in the journals affirmed strongly that historical record keeping was now a task that could be undertaken by anyone with a camera. Thank you. I just stopped sharing.
For taking us excursions into print space in and around the Ottoman land. So I think it's good that we kind of come back, full circle back to Istanbul and Ottoman lands. And I think there will be great connections probably with, for instance, the last paper in this panel by Erin, Nolan. But now the screen will be for Gizem and Vazken. We have a co-authored paper. And I'll start with introducing Gizem. Gizem Tongo is an art and cultural historian specializing in the history of late Ottoman Empire. She received her doctorate in Oriental Studies from University of Oxford, St. John's College, where she was a Lord Alverton Scholar. Tongo previously held 2 postdoctoral fellowships, the first at the University of Oxford and the second is here at British Institute at Ankara. She's particularly interested in the relationship between war and culture during conflict and its aftermath. Currently, she's working as a part-time lecturer at the Faculty of Architecture in Middle East Technical University. And the co-author of the paper is Vazken Davidian. Vazken Davidian is Gulbenkian postdoctorate fellow at the Orient Institute, University of Oxford again. He defended his doctoral thesis in art history entitled as The Figure of the Bantokt Hamal of Constantinople, late 19th century representations of migrant workers from Ottoman Armenia at Birkbeck College, University of London in 2019. He's currently working on several projects, which includes a monograph. So the floor is yours, Gizem and Vazken, and I think Gizem will start, right? So there you go.
Thank you, Semra, for this generous introduction, and thank you, Baygin Hoca, Semra again, and Daniel for the organization of this very exciting conference. So throughout my talk, I will use first-person plural, we, because I'm presenting with my dear friend and colleague, Vazken Davidian. Currently, I'm sharing the screen. I hope you can see it okay. Vazken, is it okay? Does it look fine? Whole screen? I suppose it's
fine. It's fine. It's absolutely brilliant.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. So I will present the first part, then Vazken will continue with the second section of our paper. So today we will explore the participation of the Ottoman Empire in the 1900 Universal Exposition in Paris with a focus on the art of painting. And I think I can use the, we would like to start with a quotation from what can be regarded as an official catalogue of the exposition titled Turkey and the Orient at the Exposition of 1900. Quote, "The Orient is not a land of artists. Those born in Constantinople reside in Paris and forget their country of origin. So we should not expect to discover the Grand Palace invaded by a special section of Ottoman artists. A simple room will suffice," end quote. Despite his comments about the Orient not being a land of artists and about the limited number of paintings displayed by the Ottoman Empire, the writer of the piece, the French journalist Régis Delboeuf, intended not to criticize Ottoman backwardness so much as the lack of artistic patriotism shown by certain Oriental painters who had turned their back, in his view, on properly Oriental subjects. Yet he knew that Orientalist paintings created by artists of the Ottoman Empire would fascinate the international audience in the Paris Exposition, an issue Vazken will explore in more detail. Delboeuf's use of the term country of origin to describe some entity which may be the Orient or maybe Turkey, but seems to have its locus at Constantinople, perhaps reflects the fluidity of Delboeuf's identity as a French expatriate who became one of the most important critics of Ottoman art in the imperial capital, publishing extensively on the subject, including the Francophone newspaper Istanbul. Adopting what 19th century Orientalists would call a Turkish habit, at least for a photograph taken in an Istanbul studio in a Sufi dervish costume, Delboeuf's choice of the term country of origin might also come as a surprise for us today, at least if we look at the Ottoman world from the logic of the nation state. Delboeuf's statement, however, is neither a statement of nationality nor of ethnicity. This is contrary to most existing scholarship on the exposition, which often focuses exclusively on Muslim Ottoman names. In these narratives, the participation of Armenian, Greek, or Levantine artists at best occupies a peripheral position, or at worst is simply overlooked. Our presentation today poses the art of painting in the 1900 exposition as a case study to trouble such narratives which overlook the cosmopolitan character of the Ottoman art world. Our questions are as follows. What were the goals of the Ottoman state in its participation at the 1900 Paris Exposition? How were Ottoman artworks and artists received by their Paris audience? And finally, what did it mean for Ottoman artists to be present on a global stage as Ottomans in the midst of the political conflicts of the Hamidian rule? Oops, I have to go back, yeah. The Ottoman state had participated, Apologies.
On your.
Is it automatically moving?
Oh yes, sorry. The Ottoman state had participated in world expositions since the 1851 London exhibition, including the expositions held in Paris in 1867, Vienna in 1873, and Chicago in 1893. As Selim Deringil observes, in these expositions, the Ottomans were concerned to the point of obsession with their image. What was being undertaken by the Ottoman state was nothing less than a symbolic statement of its right to exist in a world which was constantly trying to relegate it to history, end quote. Yet, to project a good image became even more necessary by the turn of the century. In 1900, it had been 7 years since the Ottoman Empire joined the last major exposition in Chicago, but much had changed since then. By this point, Sultan Abdülhamit had already gained a bad reputation for the Armenian massacres between 1894 and 1897, receiving extraordinarily bad press coverage in the West, often being referred to as the Red Sultan. The Paris Exposition of 1900 was of considerable significance for the Ottoman state. In a letter penned by the Ottoman intellectual Ebu Ziya Tevfik to the imperial secretary, whilst the measures were taken for the forthcoming exposition, it is clearly stated that if properly supervised, the exhibit would act as a very good countermeasure for all the unfavorable publicity that is propagated against our nation in Europe. The 1900 Paris exhibition was quite successful, and the Ottoman state seems to have achieved some of its objectives. The important location of its pavilion, designed by the French architect Debuisson, for instance, located among the prestigious pavilions of the nations and between the United States and Italy, while other Islamic states like Persia were relegated to the back row and Egypt was with the other colonies. The structure, as Zeynep Çelik has stated, had a bazaar, artisans' workshop, and a cafe on the ground floor, an industrial exposition on the first floor, and a military museum and a theater on the second floor. Ottoman representation in the fine arts exhibition appears to have been divided between two physical spaces, that of the Ottoman pavilion and of a small hall at the Grand Palais. Covering an area of 40,000 square meters, the construction of the Grand Palais was an impressive project aiming to host the exhibition of 100 years of French art from 1800, as well as other contemporary artists, both French and international, including the artists from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Pavilion received good coverage of the Ottoman press in all major papers, including the Servet-i Fünun, Malumat, and the Armenian daily Aravelk. Unfortunately, we have not yet found a photograph of the display for the Ottoman section in the Grand Palais like those we have for the American section. So it is currently impossible to understand the visual language of the display practice for the Ottomans or how the works were hung and arranged on the gallery walls. Neither does Delbov's catalogue contain any illustrations, sadly. Furthermore, Ottoman painting was subject to Orientalist prejudices in exhibition reviews, including an American critic who described the entries as, quote, notwithstanding the love of the prophet against the representation of the human figure or of any other living creature, end quote. The piece even continues with another condescending article claiming that, quote, from a religious hatred of idolatry, the Turk denies himself to this day the pleasure and the satisfaction of expressing his ideals of beauty upon canvas or with the chisel, end quote. Such Orientalist generalizations sound not only ideologically partial, but also overlook the multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and cosmopolitan composition of the Ottoman art world at this time. In fact, the entire Ottoman fine arts section included only one Muslim painter among 8 others, namely Halil Pasha. It's not clear, however, to what extent the Ottoman state was involved in the selection of the artist. Another interesting question is why other well-established Muslim Ottoman painters like Osman Hamdi Bey and Şeker Ahmet Pasha didn't participate in the exposition. One can see this diversity in the names of the Ottoman artists listed by Delbov including the Cairo-born Naime Kapamacıyan, daughter of the three-time Prime Minister of Egypt, Nubar Pasha, and the Russian woman Leonie Logazes, born Chumakov, who married the Ottoman Greek Logades Efendi and attaché in Paris. From the Levantine artist Emilio della Suda to the Ottoman Armenian Zakhar Zakarian, Arsen Shabanyan, and Edgar Shahin, we argue that the concept of cosmopolitanism belonged not at the margins, but rather in the center of Ottoman art as it was represented at the 1900 Paris Exposition. This, however, was de facto cosmopolitanism in the sense that it was not necessarily what the Ottoman state aimed to project, but was rather a result of the already existing plurality of the Ottoman art world. But what the artists themselves felt about this plurality, and in general about an Ottomanism which aimed to transcend religion and ethnicity, just as it was becoming more Islamic in tone under Abdülhamit, is an interesting question. I will now hand over to Vazken, who will change the direction of our inquiry to the artworks and artists themselves. We can stop sharing. The floor is yours, Vazken.
Gizem, thank you very, very much. Can you all see me?
Yes, we all see you.
You can hear me, obviously. Brilliant, brilliant. I'm so happy to be here. What a brilliant, brilliant workshop this has been so far. So thank you. And I will take on from Gizem has left on. Allow me to share my screen. And here we are. Okay. Is everything okay? Can you see it okay?
It's perfect, Vazken. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the second part of our presentation shall introduce two threads of inquiry. The first will touch upon Régis Delboeuf's notions of what constitutes an appropriate representation of what he terms the things of Turkey in the volume Turkey and the Orient at the Exposition of 1900, already introduced by Gizem. Chapter 11, entitled Art and the Ottoman Artists at the Grand Palais, records the artist's responses to the works exhibited in the room devoted to Ottoman painters. And we've already seen this. Delboeuf's main complaint lies not with the quality of the works on display, but with how Oriental artists, as he terms them, were displaying, or more appropriately, in his view, failing to display the East. The author singles out the work of Ottoman Armenian artist etcher Edgar Shahin. And here's a picture of Shahin. And I quote, Shahin, who also exhibits a very interesting series of dry points and etchings, is an artist who does honor to the Orient. Unfortunately, although he is from Constantinople, he was actually born in Vienna, but Delboeuf says, although he is from Constantinople, it is not in Istanbul or on the shores of the Bosphorus that he now seeks his subjects of observation. If we take Street Corner, the painting version of this particular etching, we can actually see right behind Shahin in the photograph. This is neither Pera nor Istanbul, but it is to the Montmartre that he will take it. Montmartre seems to haunt him. Le Pierreuse, Le Gigolette, Chateau Rouge, Place Clichy are good. These are all the different names of 17 etchings that he was displaying. But we are quite astonished to see that the special section of Turkey is filled with such subjects where the things of Turkey have so little place. And this, he continues, without wishing to diminish in any way the merit of Monsieur Shahin, whom the jury of the exhibition have rightly awarded with a gold medal. End of quote. He repeats the same sentiments in an article published in Istanbul. And again, it's the etching version. You can actually see the etching version on the left side of the image. And to the right, it's a quote direct. It's an image of his quote. Limited time allows us only to glance over some of Shahin's exhibited realist works in passing. So I just wanted to show you some of the pictures. So they're mostly images of prostitutes, like the one that was actually published in the catalogue of the Universal Exposition. Human misery, poverty, homelessness, beggars, etc. Of course, Shahin did engage with Ottoman subject matters, yet examples are few, including these two etchings from 1900. These are again sort of images of beggars. One is of a soup kitchen and the other one is of a beggar. And these are two images where he engages with Ottoman subject matters. One is a portrait of his father, and the other one is a wrestling match among a community of gypsies. So none of these images, none of these last three images appear in the exhibition. Delboeuf's disappointment at the lack of representation of the things of Turkey is ameliorated by the three pastels exhibited by the Levantine Emilio de la Suda. And I quote, "Here we find the Orient, the true Orient with its light, its transparencies, and its disturbing charm." And it's been quite difficult to actually trace images by Emilio de la Suda, but this one actually dates from 1900. Similar sentiments are expressed in response to the three paintings shown by the Ottoman Armenian long-term resident of Paris, Sarkis Tiranian, which also include a portrait of Munir Bey, the ambassador of Turkey. And I quote, "Here's another artist from Constantinople who does not forget it. He shows us a woman with opulent forms stretched out on a Turkish carpet in a room with walls carpeted with Damascus earthenware. It is a picture of real sincerity that an Oriental alone could render." And again, we haven't been able to trace the precise images that Tiranian showed at the Paris Exposition, but this should give you some idea of what kind of painting Tiranian was actually producing in this particular period. This one was shown in 1892 at one of the Paris salons and received an award. And apparently it's currently for sale for $150,000. So if any of you sort of want to purchase it, it's yours. And then another two paintings by Tiranian, again from this particular period. So this is basically what, they basically provide an idea of what an Orientalist such as Delboeuf would have regarded as a sincere depiction of the East. And of course, we can talk about this for hours, but I will move on to the second thread of the talk. So finally, to the second thread of the talk, which shall invert the question of representation from that of empire state to that of the artist. This is warranted, especially as 5 of the 8 names listed in the Ottoman section at the Grand Palais were, like Shahin, Ottoman Armenians. So my question is, our question is, how did these artists view their presence on the global stage as Ottomans at the very height of the autocratic rule of Abdülhamid II, and especially so soon after the Armenian massacres of 1894, 1897? So we turn to Shahin once again, as we have the good fortune to be privy to his personal thoughts due to access to private correspondence with his close friend, an exile and editor of the Paris Armenian language, literary and conservative-leaning journal Anahid, Arshak Chobanyan. So here's Shahin and Chobanyan. These letters point to the massacres as a watershed moment, a point of rupture during which any identification with the Abdülhamid regime, and by extension, the imperial state, had become deeply problematic. So this is a far cry from the sentiments expressed by Ottoman Armenian artists of the Tanzimat period, such as Bedros Sarabian, the celebrated decorator and realist academic painter. And this is the era that Gizem Pilakci framed so well in her paper on the Manassas earlier today. So Chobanyan and others also viewed the Ottoman participation in the exposition as an opportunity by the Abdülhamid regime to whitewash an image much tarnished by the recent massacres. He saw the dropping of charges against French newspapers characterizing the Sultan as the great assassin and the Red Sultan precisely at this point in time of the exposition as interlinked. Shahin, who had already designed a program for a musical benefit for the orphans of the Armenian massacres, organized by the League for the Rights of Man and the Citizen, held on the 16th of June, where Anatole France was a guest speaker, wrote to Chobanyan on the 28th of July, 1900, and I quote, "You will find enclosed a cutting with my letter. The Daily Chronicle, which was a London newspaper, writing on my recent solo exhibition in London, thinks that I am a Turk and expresses surprise that a Muslim could possibly produce art that is so Parisian. I have already written to the director of the Fine Arts Society and am thinking of writing directly to the Daily Chronicle so that they somehow note their error and correct it. It is an opportunity to make a gesture and repeat that I am an Armenian. He then continues. I wrote to the director explaining that, unfortunately, because of my Turkish citizenship, I was compelled, he uses the really forceful word, astipletsa, I was forced, to exhibit in the Turkish section of the Universal Exposition. I'm an Armenian, and after the massacres, I do not consider it an honor to be thought of as a Turk. These are strong words to be put in a newspaper. And after all, my father is there in Constantinople. I do not want to be the cause for his endangerment, end of quote. Şahin had also expressed his displeasure to Çobanyan at being characterized as a Turkish artist in a glowing review of his work at the exhibition by the art critic Gustave Geoffroy in Le Journal. On his instigation, on Şahin's instigation, Çobanyan wrote to the art critic, who had also referred to Zakarian as a Greek artist. The letter was published in Anahit. Geoffroy corrected his error in his next article entitled Armenia, which included quotes from Çobanyan referring to massacres. On the 28th of August and the 4th of September, Şahin sent notes of appreciation to Çobanyan. In the latter, he writes, Aferin and merci for what you wrote to Geoffroy in Le Journal. The publication of your letter deserves much applause, not only for my own sake. I am of course grateful for myself, but especially for us all and for our poor country. End of quote. It is therefore clear that at least for this one artist, the most decorated Ottoman participant at the Universal Exposition of 1900, he won a gold medal for his etchings, but he also won a bronze medal for his paintings. Being represented as a Turk on the global stage had caused discomfort. The private correspondence that has reached us directly links this displeasure to the recent massacres organized by the Abdülhamid regime. While we still have not come across any material to suggest how other artists viewed their own participation in the Ottoman section at the Grand Palais, we know that at least Çobanyan and Zakarian had, like Şahin, donated works in aid of raising funds to house and educate the orphans of the massacres. They would certainly have had their own views on the matter. In conclusion, this joint paper has argued that exploring the participation of the Ottoman Empire at the 1900 Paris Exposition with a focus on the so-called fine arts enables not only a reassessment of what country of origin meant for 19th century Ottoman artists, but also provides insights, firstly, into diversities often ignored within art histories defined in the literature as national, and secondly, the complex and changing identities of Ottoman artists during a period of major political transformation. Thank you very much. And I'll just reduce I'll stop sharing my screen. And here we are. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Vazken and Gizem. That was really great to see, of course, not only the World Fair sites, the architecture and fair site itself, but the expectation from the artists and how they try to present, or they were like evaluated as failing to display certain kind of identities regarding particularly East Orient. And now we will pass to the final paper of today's workshop by Erin Nolan. If we can see Erin, yes. Hi. And Erin, hi. Nolan is a visiting assistant professor at Maine College of Art. She received her PhD from Boston University in 2017. As an art historian, she examines the photographic history and visual cultures of the Islamic world, particularly in Europe, the Mediterranean, and Central Asia. Her articles on visual culture from the Islamic world have been published in academic journals such as Ars Orientalis and the Trans-Asia Photography Review, and most recently on the Digital Transatlantic Cultures platform. She's currently completing 2 book manuscripts, a monograph entitled Portrait Atlas, the circulation of 19th century Ottoman portrait photographs, and a co-authored text with Dr. Emily Walker, reading Native American photographs in Ottoman. So her papers title is Towards a Radical Cartography of Ottoman Landscape Photographs. So the screen is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen here. Believe that you can see that now.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Semra, and to all of the organizers and the British Institute in Ankara for hosting the event, and to my wonderful panelists for your exciting papers, which I think very much speak to my own. So I'm excited about all of those connections, especially to Ahmet Ersoy, one of my mentors, who I'm excited to share the screen with today, and for all of his many conversations which have informed my own thinking about the Hamidian archive. I'm speaking to you today from my home in Portland, Maine, which is the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which includes the Abenaki, the Micmac, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Maliseet nations. This albumin print illustrates a panoramic vision of the military preparatory school in Aleppo. It comprises 2 individual photographs that fit together to form a larger panel. A seam separates the original images, bifurcating the finished photograph. What first appears as an unbroken panorama emerges as a composite scene, one that situates the viewer at the very center of the image. This application of photographic collage demonstrates a familiarity with and acceptance of the artificial nature of photography, inviting commentary about landscape as cultural practice, an agent of power, and medium of exchange. The fact that both sides of this image are smoothly aligned, notwithstanding, the exterior gate and school buildings unabashedly illustrate how this representation was engineered, revealing an iconographic rupture which often marks late Ottoman photographs. The manual manipulation of the picture plane, as seen in this example, which is from the Abdul Hamid albums, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a collection gifted by the Ottoman Sultan to the United States in 1893 and also to Britain in 1894. And this demonstrates a calculated interest in the surface of the print, in which parcels of land are photographically stitched together to form what I would call a man-altered landscape. Joel Snyder might call this image a disinterested report, suggesting it presents a perspective that is detached from an individual viewpoint. Such institutional and collective vision promises neutrality, but photographs are never neutral, and what this image neutralizes are the students not pictured here. What if the imperial space rendered functions not only as historical, but also as topographical and transnational? What if the street view of this military school is shaped simultaneously by the texture of the cobblestones, the lush branches extending skyward behind the garden wall, and by the stories, struggles, and attitudes that reveal this space as a site of interrelationship? These questions transform the military preparatory school in Aleppo, and by extension, the photographic space within the Hamidian archive, into what scholar Bill Rankin would call a radical cartography. A radical cartography meaning, a radical cartography in which meaning making happens as images circulate around and throughout 19th century social networks. To understand notions of mapping power, that is how cartographic regimes visualize their dominance, I will take up W.J.T. Mitchell's observation that landscape functions as a verb. To landscape, virtually or materially, is to assert an order, to take hold or control. The impulse to survey, both lands and bodies, highlights the camera as an appropriative instrument of control utilized in forms of photographic surveillance, something that was quite popular across 19th century geographies. My paper connects imperial modes of control under Abdul Hamid to the construction of official landscape photographs, which were deployed in the service of the Ottoman court's larger cartographic regime. While histories and cultures of landscape photography are often conceptualized in terms of surveys, My analysis reimagines photographs of the 19th century Ottoman domains by referencing placemaking and identity, especially through a relational discourse in which these images align with representations of land exchanged and displayed across the Atlantic Ocean. By emphasizing the cultural contingency of photographic representations, I write an art history about diplomacy, borders, and alterity, where technologies of vision are culturally and historically bound. Performing pious, innovative, and modern identities was at the core of Ottoman statecraft under Abdülhamid, as many of you have already noted today. Take, for example, this album in the Ömer Koç collection. A similar album exists in the Istanbul University Library archive as well. And what we see here are different medical procedures, or the aftermath of them. Assembled, as Zeynep Çelik has noted, by surgeon Ahmet Nureddin and photographer Nikolaos Andreomenos, there are 13 portraits of women treated for uterine and ovarian cancer tumors. Good citizens of empire, the women stand beside their malignancies, which sit floating and contained in glass jars. They wear simple striped hospital gowns and white headgear open to the oval of their face and the oval of their abdomens, revealing vivid surgical scars. Here, the camera, and by extension, the imperial medical system, naturalize the female body. This album presents not simply a censoring, but a removal, an extraction, which when viewed in the context of the larger Ottoman social milieu, expands outside of hospital walls to the landscape, outside of hospital walls, to the landscape, to the imperial domains and territory. The extraction here is twofold. The tumors are extracted from the bodies, and the camera further extracts the bodies from the hospital into the tidy taxonomy of a photograph album. I want to include this, not because I plan to talk about medical procedures for the remainder of my talk. Instead, I want us to think capaciously about the relationship between land, identity, and photographs. I want to tell a different kind of story about the photographs made in the Hamidian era and that connect the state-sanctioned control of bodies, particularly the female body, which you see here, to the state-sanctioned control of land, which helps us to see that in fact there is another story to tell. And by viewing the censorship of the body together with the censorship of land, or the construction of land, as you can see materially in this collage, we might understand how photographic visualizations demarcate space, delineate borders, and inscribe perhaps even a violent order on many different kinds of bodies. This violence attests to this notion, which my colleague Chris Malcolm has called cartographic regimes, something I referred to earlier. Cartographic regimes, which are ways of perceiving, navigating, and orienting to the world. In light of recent debates regarding travel bans, the tenets of citizenship, and global migration, especially during our seemingly never-ending pandemic, the surveillance of land and its photographic image warrant renewed attention, especially as relics of the imperial enterprise. Now more than ever, 19th century survey campaigns, like those commissioned by Abdülhamid, resonate as global practices that share a pictorial language used to capture topographical space. These images shape territorial expansion and legitimized imperial politics. My project defines landscape not as a fixed concept or on a continuum, but as an active practice. To take a landscape photograph, therefore, means to transform space into a controlled vision. As Liz Wells suggests, this vision is governed by naturalized cultural and social constructions. By 1890, military preparatory schools were opened in Ottoman provincial capitals like Aleppo, in every Ottoman provincial capital, like the one in Aleppo. And the bifurcation that we see here, the bifurcation of the front of the school building and wall, asserts the court's power to take apart and rebuild, to occupy and educate. So by visually transforming the facade of the school, this image speaks to the ways in which the Hamidian court transformed the Ottoman social body. As a whole, the 51 albums in the Abdülhamid collection, which now reside in the Library of Congress and the British Library, are not based on topographical specificity, but rather on the photographic allusion to the historic and geographically vast Ottoman domains. Assembled over a 13-year period between 1880 and 1893, they emerged out of a larger 19th century survey movement. And by its very nature, the photographic survey consisted of disparate images collected around a common theme and amassed to form a visual record available for national posterity, much like one album about Istanbul's Tophane neighborhood, which you see on the screen. For the Ottomans, in general, this theme centered on progress, military, industrial, cultural, and educational, which was recognized and applauded in their diplomatic relationship with the United States, particularly. In the words of the American consul Alexander Russell Webb, there was, quote, wonderful progress made by Turkey under its present Sultan Abdul Hamid. This album then illustrates Webb's notion, the American notion of wonderful progress. It codifies the 19th century desire to record military advancements. Yet, the sequence of these photographs remains indeterminate in their seriality, demonstrating a mutability that is distinctly modern. In one image from what I call the Tophane album, government buildings and waterfront mansions shimmer across the Bosphorus Strait. Two minarets from the 19th century, Nusretiye Mosque, pierce the sky, extending above the hills of Pera. The long facade of the Ottoman Imperial School of Civil Engineering separates the city from the Silver Sea, marking the boundary with an even density that stretches across the middle of the image and is interrupted only by a small outcropping of leafy trees. By dividing this coastline into a distantly ordered cityscape, the geometry of these buildings embodies control. Yet in viewing this photograph alongside another one of the American West, included in an album gifted to Abdul Hamid in 1886 by President Grover Cleveland, and so Abdul Hamid would have received the Cleveland album before he sent back to the United States the 51 album collection in which the Tophane album is a part. So if we look at these images together, we can see that the work also functions beyond the context of nation, operating in international survey practices which were directly in dialogue with one another. Like the American William Henry Jackson's view of Lake San Cristobal, this photograph emphasizes natural resources while also conversing with images like the one of the US Capitol building in Washington, DC that you see here, communicating notions of statecraft defined by incorporation, mobilization, and surveillance. The Tophane album contains 28 albumin prints by the Ottoman Armenian firm Abdullah Frere, depicting imperial artillery, engineering schools, and the shores of the Tophane neighborhood. Yet in their sequencing, the photographs evoke something more, something raw and labyrinthine, an unpredictable narrative that moves quickly between the facade of the School of Engineering, target practice, the barracks and drill hall, student exercises in a courtyard, and a walled garden. The final 8 photographs in the album shift between posed group portraits of students and collections of imperial cannons. Here, the cylindrical forms of the figures transform into the cylindrical forms of the cannons. And as the album unfolds, the men and the machines begin to merge. The rigid verticality of the students moves toward a rigid horizontality. The intermingling of images showing Ottoman soldiers and Ottoman weapons echoes a similar consolidation of Ottoman weapons and Ottoman photography, where photographs were employed as instruments of political warfare. As these demonstrate, photography was fully integrated into the administrative branch of court life. The first Muslim photographers came from military backgrounds. They learned technical skills at the Imperial College for Engineers, where a printing house doubled as a photography studio. And at the request of the palace, military offices like the Tophane, shown here, received these albums for safe, not this exact album, but some very similar albums for safekeeping. In this album, the arrangement of images, as I've mentioned, resists categorization. Despite varied content and individual compositions, the picture sequence is not clinical, Cartesian, or orderly. It is open, it is raw, and it is representative of the larger photographic corpus at Yildiz Palace, which, as Ahmet Ersoy and Denise Türker have suggested, carried no autonomy, spilling easily into the public sphere where archival documents fell outside of official control. This rawness, this openness, materializes in the medium's synthetic qualities. Through manipulation techniques such as fragmenting, cutting, and rephotographing, the prints splice together an artificial yet utopian vision of the late imperial state. Like the experimental albums of Victorian photo collage, which are paradigmatic of the 19th century appreciation for juxtaposition and eclecticism, the Hamidian albums demonstrate a distinctly modern application of the medium, operating as tools for the construction of a new reality. This new reality materializes as landscape photography in the most expansive sense of the expansive sense of the word. What these images that I've shared with you today communicate is that the survey impulse, a trend which gestured in many directions, was a global impulse. Therefore, we must view the Ottoman material through the framework of the International Photographic Survey movement. These representations of land embodied shared projections on the environment, founded on diplomatic, ideological, and visual interrelationships. By materializing differently in different cultures, however, this practice emerges not only as shared, but also as a radical cartography, which recharts Ottoman geography as something defined through dynamic visualizations of placemaking and identity. As my colleague, Dr. Emily Volker, and I have argued elsewhere, mirroring the United States' efforts to construct national heritage through the intermingling of photographs that celebrate the monumentality of American wilderness and showcase indigenous peoples. The Hamidian albums present a vast ecosystem of photographs mapping Ottoman territory, innovations, and people. As more than visual embodiments of imperialism, they visualize situations of transnational cultural contact. The construction of the social body through survey practices in these multi-part modernizing empires was imagined, revised, and reformed through this ongoing cross-pollination of archives across the Atlantic. I will end my talk today with a call to take these radical cartographies seriously as we consider our own new reality, one which maybe doesn't seem so new anymore, one that seems to be truly, though, still a future of the unknown. The landscape photograph unearths far more than long-buried connections between photographic practices across Islamic and Euro-American worlds. It also opens up new avenues for thinking about our own current moment, as we have been over the last 2 years quite homebound in working with new modes of mobility and technologies of connectivity. We might consider if the photograph now precedes the map, which previously, according to Baudrillard, preceded the territory. Can the photograph, to borrow his words, engender territory? What, for instance, might this collaged image of the military school in Aleppo teach us about the construction of national boundaries and cultural sovereignty when the pandemic seems to know no borders? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, which has, I think, strong connections, as you also yourself mentioned, with what Ahmet Hocam presented in the beginning of this session, talking about these archaeological imaginations on the really photos of the landscape, and also in the the distant alien past sort of arisen on the screen, on the print spaces on Ottoman journals now. So I'd like to ask Ahmet Hocam and also Vazken to turn on their cameras so that maybe we will feel a bit more like, yes, great to see everyone, to start the Q&A session. So we are now checking if there are any questions. And we already saw hands raised, right? Okay, Ahmet Hocam, you have a question asked by Mehmet Emin Yoldaş, and he asks if you could talk about other illustrated Ottoman newspapers as well.
Forever. But I'll try to put it in a nutshell. Yes, I particularly concentrated on Servet-i Fünun because it's the most representative and the most popular and the most long-lasting publication of the period. But of course, the kind of patterns, the kind of approaches to the past that I'm thinking about are also evidenced in many other illustrated journals, like Malumat, like Marif, later on Shehbal, and they do include all of these new multimedial genres, like letters with photographs that the readers send, for instance, to the journals. That's something that I didn't have a chance to talk about. But one of the images that I showed had the photograph of the island of Akdamar in Lake One, for instance. That's one of the very few examples that I had encountered where you have a Christian monument being represented. But that is part of a letter with a photograph, somebody from Van, the distant eastern city of Van, who was a subscriber to the Servet-i Fünun, kept sending these letters that were accompanied by photographs. And you would have these like ethnographic scenes, women making bread, and then, you know, dilapidated monuments, the landscape, and then they would publish the letter as well. This was something that you would see in other illustrated journals as well, especially in Malumat. Another very commonly shared kind of format was city letters, where either the editors of the journals or specific city letter writers like Ahmet Rasim would go around the city day and night and recount their kind of experiences in this very new, lively, very visually charged kind of language. And sometimes these would also be accompanied by photographs. And then you have the travel diaries, again, accompanied by photographs, most of the time following the routes, the newly opened routes of the Ottoman railways. So these are very commonly shared. And I hope I had the time to show you other examples, but you know, it was just a personal decision to concentrate on Servet-i Fünun. So it's all over the place.
Thank you. And I think it's a like kind of a parallel or great connection with what Erin suggested as like, or had this term as the man-altered viewpoints, right? Or landscaping as an active, like participatory activity. So in the Abdülhamid's album's case, there is this royal, sultanic kind of authority, but in these cases, there is even more like civilian and like bottom-up kind of active participation to sort of illustrate, to visualize the empire from different viewpoints. So I think it's a great connection in that regard. Thank you, Hocam. So let's check the chat box if there are any questions.
I can ask one.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so I have a question for Erin, and I was wondering how much we know about the production of the Abdülhamid albums. Do we know which photos were not selected, and do we know who was doing the selection and ordering? Because it seems like the ordering and selection was very critical to your argument.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this is a part of the chapter in my book, which I am in the process of finalizing the research for. But as you know, doing that kind of research has been hard over the last couple of years. So I'll do my best to answer your question. I know, to my knowledge, nobody has gone through yet and figured out all of the images that were taken and all of the images that were accepted and all of the images that were not accepted, right? In many photographic archives, more in 20th century ones, I think of like the FSA archive at the Library of Congress, right? We know which negatives Roy Stryker punched a hole punch through, and it's not quite as concrete in terms of what was thrown out. We do know that it was a collective authorship and that it was not just Abdülhamid who was making these decisions. but multiple people underneath him within the court. So I would say that it definitely is a multi-author engagement in that way. And as far as I can tell, there are a variety of different viziers and members high up in the court who are probably the ones ultimately making those decisions underneath Abdulhamid and for him. But again, it would need to be an album by album. I'm pretty sure it's an album by album decision, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, I will just add that in some albums, yes, in most of the albums, there is just one photographer, where you see the consistency of one studio across the album. So there is that is the one sort of unifying aspect, I think, to it, more so than actually the subject matter or the composition of the images, but that there is, generally speaking, one studio that is assigned to one album.
Thank you very much for your answer. So I would like to also ask, like, here as well, if there are any questions.
Actually, I have a question to Erin. Was it a common practice for the states gifting photographic albums, or was it only peculiar to the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, that's a great question. You mean the ethnographic albums of native peoples?
Well, any kind of photographic.
Any kind, yeah. No, it was.
Was it like a common practice for the states, for the empires to do that, or?
Yes, it was very much common practice. It was very much entangled and a part of diplomatic practice and gift exchange in the late 19th century. And we do know that, for example, the United States gifted these kinds of albums of indigenous peoples, not only to the Ottoman Empire, but also to France and to multiple other empires in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s as a part of diplomatic exchange. So in many ways, you can kind of constellate actually this photographic gift exchange between, or, transatlantically back and forth between different empires at this moment in time. And in many cases, what my colleague Emily Volker really focuses on is these albums, which were ultimately put in the Bureau of American Ethnology, the BAE, and then they would create these sort of bespoke albums, like the one that's in the Abdulhamid, in the Yıldız Palace archive in Istanbul University Library, where there are many of the same images that are in other albums in other royal collections, but they're not always ordered or sequenced exactly the same way.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, I had a question actually in my mind to Vazken and Gizem, but I will start first, Ahmet Hocam. This is for Vazken and Gizem, and Ahmet Ersoy asks, how was the Ottoman participation to the 1900 fair perceived in the Ottoman Armenian press? Yes, that's actually, I think, a great aspect of your paper, that adding to this Armenian press and reception of these fairs.
And maybe on how did it differ from the
if you could compare, yes.
Maybe would you like to start, Vazken?
Or Gizem, I'm sure, of course. Ahmed, it's great to see you. It's a great question as well. Hi, and we basically had a look at Arabelk, and we are also going to look at Byzantion, which were published in Constantinople. And then it's very interesting to sort of compare the tone with Anahit, which was published by an exile in Paris. So the tone is very, very different. So Arabelk, for example, sort of celebrates Ottoman participation, but they only mention 5 Armenian artists in passing, without really, really sort of concentrating on painting that much. So they sort of look at the pavilion, they look at sort of other aspects of the Ottoman sort of participation and the general sort of exposition as well. Now, Anahid and Arshak Chobanyan, who was the editor, but of course, let's not forget that he was a conservative, and despite being conservative, he was in very, very warm and cordial terms with representatives of the Young Turks who are also exiles in Paris. So I think one of the points that we're trying to make is that the massacres was a point of rupture, sort of when it comes to this. So after the massacres, his tone basically changed, and he was far more outspoken. So he was obviously really, really proud of the Armenian artists who represent the Ottoman Empire, but not that proud that they were being represented as Ottoman. And he sort of tied those artists together with others in other sort of pavilions who are Armenian, and they were basically sort of representing their own works. For example, the Hungarian pavilion and especially the Persian pavilion, where I think it was Diran Kelekian's collection that was displayed as part of the Persian pavilion, even though he was an Ottoman Armenian. And the other thing is he also tried to sort of look at other Armenians who were being represented, again, Ottoman Armenians, in other sort of parts of the exposition. Now, it's very interesting for Gizem and me because we are not at this moment precisely 100% sure as to how these artists were sort of selected. And when Edgar Shahin says that he was forced to exhibit in the Ottoman section, but then again, you have Sebul Begyan, who basically presents a sculpture. He's an Ottoman citizen, but he's in the international section. We're not told which bit he's actually exhibiting his work on. And finally, they also mention a participation of a couple of paintings by Ayvazovsky, the Russian Armenian artist who just died. So that's very much the look. Sort of whether the newspapers are actually published in the Ottoman Empire or outside, they have slightly different takes. Does that answer the question at all? Or?
Yeah, I would like to add on this that, you know, I mean, different from the, for instance, 1873 exhibition, we don't have much coverage about the 1900 Paris exhibition in the Ottoman media, newspapers, but there is, I mean, I'm not saying there's nothing. In fact, I showed Servet-i Fünun, Malumat, and there's some articles in İktam, but most of the articles, like even one of the articles that I found that says Sanayi Nefise Şubesi in Servet-i Fünun doesn't really talk about the artists. So they don't really focus on the artworks themselves. The most important articles we see about the 1900 exhibition comes from the Francophone newspaper Istanbul. And these are written by Dalbeuf and also Protexta Le Comte. He writes like in 1901. And what is really interesting that he's quite critical of the fact that artists like Osman Hamdi, artists like Şeker Ahmet Pasha didn't participate in these exhibitions where they would actually, show the Ottoman Empire proudly, you know, which is quite interesting to see. And there are different tones, I think. You know, we're trying to compare how the exhibition was received in different newspapers and journals, and of course Armenian newspapers published in Istanbul, quite different from the ones published outside. I hope I mean, we managed to answer your question, Ahmet.
Thank you very much. So, okay, we have another question for Ahmet Hocam from the one of the speakers. Actually, I'm liking this like very interactive final session, so I'll keep my questions myself, and then maybe we will discuss it together. So, Erin asked to Ahmet Ersoy, is photographic collage commonly found in these journals, these collages, photographic collages? If so, how does this materialize in the Ottoman illustrated press? This seems very visually avant-garde for the time period as compared to other cultural contexts. And she thanks in advance. Yes, Hocam.
Wonderful question. Yani Erin, Gizem, Vazken, and I, if you let us, we'll just take forever. Yani we can keep on going forever, but I mean, this is the first image that you showed, Erin, was I mean, I said, oh, okay, this is something that I had been, you know, trying to approach, trying to understand in you know, my forays into the Hamidian archives, because I've seen so many examples of this, even more radical. Like I remember an album compiled by some provincial hospital, where they apparently, shot the pictures of the laboratories, the halls, and so on, but there were no people in it, apparently. And then they cut off images of people and inserted them there, for why, I don't know, for some reason. But they have this completely doctored, constructed, composite reality prepared. I'm not going to say for the Sultan, because it's for the archive. We're talking about a modern archive here. But that kind of doctored imagery, I rarely come across in the journals. What I see happening more and more towards the end of the century is taking separate individual photographs and making compositions, putting them in broader compositional arrangements, rather than actually, as far as I know, doctoring the images themselves. That's not something that I see. It's very interesting. I mean, it's a very interesting question. I don't have an answer. I cannot explain, what constitutes the difference. But the short is no, and the longer answer is beats me. I don't know.
Can I add one thing? Thank you,
Yeah.
Ahmed. I was thinking about the cover you showed, where it's like a fan of the overlapping images. I don't remember the title of the. You know what I'm talking about? And so they're not actually. Oh, you know
I
of
made
the
that.
of the. Oh, so it's not. You actually pasted the images over it. It's not actually printed.
Are you
like that.
talking about like different journal issues on top of each other?
No, it's like a front of a journal, and I thought there were multiple photographs pasted, like overlapping.
Yeah. Okay, sure.
That's original.
That's authentic. Yes.
Yeah. So I was thinking even about that overlapping of the images, because maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you even see that in the illustrated picture press in Europe until like Vous magazine comes out, right? Until the 1920s. And so it's really interesting that there's like this really like avant-garde and sort of creative mode of thinking about the overlapping of images and the ways in which the images interact with the text in the image you showed. Because as far as I know, in the illustrated picture press, at least in France, I don't think that happens until you see like press photography, and you see the development of Vous and then Life and like these picture journals. So I don't know. It was like the fact that it's so much earlier was really, really interesting. And I wasn't sure if there were other examples. That's all.
No, that's a very good point. It's worth checking. Yeah. It's also the fact that, we tend to think of these images as, photographs being represented there, but there are so many intermediaries. The process is so, involves so many agents who are actually using their hands. You're not just taking the photograph and putting it on the page. There's somebody who is basically inscribing the surface of zinc in order to transfer the image onto paper. So it's, originally it's already artificial and doctored, and then you have more complex versions of it. We should talk about this more. It's a good point, but I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have a very limited time, so I'll go for the final question raised by Damla Göre to Erin, Nolan. As a part of these albums, I have seen some examples that also survey some single standing buildings and interiors of Nişantaşı konaks. They are very generic, but also very specifically capturing some decorative details. They very much talk with the other albums. Could you also reflect on the different themes in these albums? How would you read them in your excellent analysis of larger context of these albums?
Thank you. I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, the themes in the Hamidian in the Abdulhamid collection range from landscapes very expansively to architectures and architectural ruins, to student portraits, to different examples of military achievements and educational buildings across the empire. And so those are the sort of major themes, the big umbrella themes within the collection. And then of course there's smaller sub-themes, but I think if I understand your question correctly, and you're asking about this sort of like generic photograph that also has this this precision, right, and this attention to detail that can communicate something really geographically or regionally specific, but also speak generally to larger themes of photographic albums. And I think what you're getting at is this sort of survey impulse, which I was speaking a little bit about, which is this idea of photographing, you know, essentially the world in which we live around us, right? To see and to survey and to know and control that space. It's interesting. There's not a lot of like generic and then architectural detail shots, as far as I know, in the Abdülhamid collection. We do see many other surveys. Certainly, there's European surveys of buildings across the Eastern Mediterranean that do this, right? We know August Saltzman's survey of Jerusalem comes to mind. So indeed, what you're suggesting is already part of a cross-cultural conversation in terms of how architecture and in terms of how buildings are being photographed and communicated. What would be interesting to see is how, you know, if those perspectives and sightlines are the same, and if the camera technology is being employed exactly in the same way in this example that you give of the Nişantaşı Konex, right? Or in the other examples, like the Jerusalem album, which of course I think is earlier in the 19th century. But in many cases, I think, like, I even think of like the Cresswell archive, which was documenting Islamic architecture and buildings, right, in the early 20th century, which does that, which looks at details, you know, has this almost cinematographic, is that the right word? I'm sorry, cinematographic quality of like zooming in and zooming out, right? And so you do see that across, and oftentimes it's used as a didactic tool to educate, right? Both educate architects, educate artists, educate people about certain architectural ideologies as well. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think that's how I understood it. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Erin. And we have also a question about the availability of this presentation. Actually, there will be the video of the whole day, the workshop from the beginning till the end on the YouTube channel of British Institute at Ankara. So if you follow that channel, I think very soon it will be available for everyone. And we have like the final question, or there is Gizem's question.
I can reserve.
No, I think you can just raise it.
Okay, it's more of a comment, and thank you to everyone for their wonderful presentations. But this is a question, or rather a comment, that I would like to sort of address to Gizem and Vazken, and kind of like engage with it. I guess I want to be like, I want to see what your perspective is on this. So sort of referring back to your article, Vazken, if I'm not mistaken, it was Image of an Atrocity, where you looked at Hovhannes Ayvazyan's, or like Ayvazovsky's, like depiction of the massacre in Trebizond. And how, like, you know, even though he was this figure who had sort of a relationship with the Ottoman court, and he had received certain, like a number of medals, that he severed that connection after, you know, the massacre, and he wanted kind of like, he threw away like the medals and so on. And and also like Şahinyan, who again sort of wanted to distance himself from his sort of Ottoman identity. And yet we also have these figures like, for instance, Joseph Manas, on whom I haven't really focused. And I know you own a painting by him. So I wonder sort of how, like, we should assess, for instance, his sort of continuing collaboration with the Ottoman court, because I think in 1899, he does an engraving for the German Empress, and yet I think this is a commission he secures through the court. And I do know that like he was like keeps receiving pensions and so on after he retires. And sort of this kind of idea that obviously there's no single Armenian experience and there's no single Armenian perception. This is something that we both try and raise all the time. And sort of like, I wanted to sort of see what, like how you would engage with this.
Gizem, do you want to go first or shall I?
I mean, I'm just gonna focus on the thing she says last, which is definitely no single Armenian experience. You can't really approach, Armenians as the monolithic, homogeneous thing that everybody was either anti-Abdülhamid or pro-Abdülhamid. Of course, they differed among themselves in terms of their political ideas, much more. Some were conservative, some were more liberal, and some were, some left, like Şahin was very critical of him being called a Turkish artist. I think this is why kind of a challenging, a great example to prove that. And I leave the answer to you, Vazken, to continue.
Gizem P. I think that's a really good comment. It's a really good observation. The way I think about it is, well, you mentioned three artists: Ayvazovsky, and then Manas, and then Şahin, and they're three different people, completely three different experiences. So Ayvazovsky, first of all, wasn't an Ottoman citizen. He was a Russian Armenian. He was from Crimea, but he had a fantastic relationship with the palace, especially under sort of Abdülmecid and Abdülaziz. So, and he was very close to the palace in those days. But with Abdülhamid, there was a rupture, and I think the rupture again. I think the massacres are the key moment where this actually did take place, and he sort of did cause the minor diplomatic incident between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire when he threatened to throw his medals into the sea and all the rest. So Ayvazovsky is a very specific example, and also he was a superstar on the world stage as a seascape artist. He was, there was no one as famous as him. Manas, this much better than I do. Again, sort of, I see the Manases in terms of as a family. I don't know whether it would be correct to sort of call them as a sort of dynasty of painters, just like the Balyans were a dynasty of architects. But sort of their work is very much sort of associated, or the work that I know of, I've seen. I look forward to reading your PhD on the subject. Is very much associated with the palace, with the state, etc. Şahin's a different case because he was born in Vienna when his parents were traveling, and he grew up in Istanbul. Then he was sent in 1890, if I'm not mistaken, to study in Venice. And then 1895, he made it to Paris. So he didn't really spend that much time in the Ottoman Empire. And his experience was very much from what he did experience and what he heard from his parents. We're really lucky that we have quite a large number of letters by him. So, these letters weren't really for sort of for the public sort of eye. So they're actually quite private letters. So obviously he was really strongly affected by the massacres. And again, he points out in at least 2 or 3 letters that after the massacres, I no longer want to be described as a Turk or as an Ottoman. So I was forced to show my work in the Ottoman section. So, we're talking about a particular moment and the rupture, but there were also other artists as well. For example, Zakarian and Diranyan had been in Paris for a long time. And Diranyan, for example, who was a student of Guillemets, and then he moved to Paris. He was very successful. If I'm not mistaken, I haven't really looked into him that much, but he was at some point he was being funded by the Ottoman state at some point for a number of years. So I would say that each artist's experience is different, but this particular period, the 1890s, really interests me because a large number of Ottoman artists left Istanbul mostly. Some, among the Armenians, some went to the Russian Empire, others went to France or Italy. The thing with the Armenian artists is that they didn't really go back, with 1 or 2 exceptions, but then they escaped. Well, they fled again. But I'm really interested in how, let's say, Ottoman Muslim artists who are critical of the state sort of, how they actually, what was their experience? And what was the experience of Greek artists, for example? Of course, they have the Kingdom of Greece to go to. Whereas the Armenians, there was no Armenian state, there was no Armenian nation state. So, there was no such possibility. So I think it's a really large question and there is no one answer. So we need to look at the different artists. Specificity again is the main thing there. Does that answer the question?
Wonderful answer. Thank you. Very detailed. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think that will bring us to the right or
that's the end. Actually, what I'm going to suggest is that if all of our speakers who are still conscious and present, could they turn on their cameras so we can make a kind of virtual group photo of sorts, and while that's happening, maybe you and Belgen would like to say last comments.
Okay, let me start with them and then I will leave the floor to you. Thank you very much for this very rather long, but I think very fruitful day-long workshop. And I think that we have still almost 40 attendees other than us, the panelists. Thank you very much for the audience as well, and for everyone who are joining from different parts of the world. And it will be, as I said before, presentations will be available. And I also would like to thank again Belgin Hocam once more and British Institute at Ankara. I hope this cooperation will go on, maybe turn into something else. I hope it starts something bigger and we will continue our discussions. And then I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Semra. I think we have been exposed to such a rich material and we all have to go home and digest it. I'm really very happy about it. But perhaps one thing that we can say that we have seen the Ottoman actors full participation into the 19th century cultures or mobility that we were aiming at. But one thing that I think I will be taking from all these talks today is the necessity. I mean, we have started with the idea of giving it to the Ottoman agency, but of course, what is clear now is the nuance that we need when we are talking about the Ottoman agency, all these different actors. The variety of the agency when we are talking about the Ottoman side of the story I was talking about earlier. So I think this was a wonderful, very productive, thought-provoking day. So I would like to thank to all of our participants, authors, who have really stayed with us for years, actually. So we are really very, very grateful for that. And also to the audience, I think that we have received wonderful questions. And I think on that note, perhaps I can just pass the baton to
Can I just add,
Daniel?
Yeah, Hocam, before you, sorry. I also would like, I felt that, for instance, the gender aspect, the women travelers, or I don't know, women artists in the fairs, not only as the subject of the paintings, but the women artists and other maybe gendered aspects will be a great addition. So there is really no end. It is kind of the starting point. Just to highlight this, still we need much more. And today that part I feel raised the least. So I just wanted to add that. And then now our the moderator actually of the day, Daniel.
Yeah, just I want to thank all of the speakers. I want to thank the audience, especially given that we had some, teething problems with presenting people's videos and everything else in this kind of hybrid format. So we'll get better at it, although hopefully we won't have to endure so many pandemic-related restrictions for too much longer. The videos, I just put a link in the chat to the BIA's YouTube channel. The videos will take some time to process, but next week, they should be available and you can then peruse them at your leisure, rewatch your favorite moments, and share them to the people who could not be present today. Again, thank you on behalf of BIA, look forward to future configurations where we might find ourselves present again together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, virtual club.